EHL can be implemented for different subject areas. And I know that Thomas also wanted to welcome you while I was doing that. So he's on camera now. So I'll go ahead and do that while people trickle in. And if you were here the last time, we would like to know in the chat. If you're new, we would also like to know that. I think that's going to be the icebreaker question in the chat for today.
Hey everyone, welcome back, or welcome if you're new to Exploring Humanitarian Law. Tonight's 2 of a 3-night program that's spread over the course of 3 weeks. If you're just watching this on a recording, or this is your first session, don't worry, you can go back and watch part 1. We're going to be getting that posted to our YouTube channel, the Red Cross IHL YouTube channel, in the coming days. So by the end of the week, both night 1 and night 2 will be available on its own playlist. You can also go to that channel. So if you search American Red Cross IHL program or Red Cross IHL, you should find our channel. We'll put the link in the chat here to get you directly to our channel, but it's a repository of all of our webinar events. So you can find everything from pop culture events to just basic foundational building block classes on IHL. It's really the full range of content that's on there. That's where we house quite literally everything that we host here at the national headquarters level. So we've got a really packed night tonight. We're going to be moving really quickly, but we're really honored to be joined by a great expert and somebody who's importantly implemented EHL again and again out there in the field. An educator, Dr. Amy Atchison, and just a phenomenal Red Cross volunteer. She's going to be teaching the block on the differences between international humanitarian law and international human rights law. So you're going to get to talk more with Amy last time. The way that we approached things last time with having sort of an informal approach with regard to questions and answers, that really worked well. We had a really active chat last time. So get involved, tell us where you're tuning in from, ask questions, make comments in the chat. Those of us who are not actively presenting are going to be in the chat interacting with you. And we want that exchange. Naturally, the webinar format doesn't allow everybody to be on camera and speaking at the same time. But we had really great interactions last time. And this is a great opportunity to pick, in particular, Amy's brain about how this looks in the classroom. So whether you're a Red Cross volunteer who's watching this video or sitting in this presentation to learn more, to go out and connect with educators in your area, or you're an educator yourself and you're looking to decide whether to implement this sort of thing in your classroom, we have a phenomenal resource here today, and we're going to learn a lot of really great stuff, with the exception of the things that I'll teach, because you'd probably just be better off looking at puppy pictures. Kidding. But without further ado, I'll kick it back over to Taya. Hopefully you found the poster. I'll go ahead and put the YouTube link into the chat, and we'll see you shortly. Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, apparently you haven't fully enabled me to share anything yet with everyone. So both the PowerPoint and the
whoopsies
poster, I have not been able to share, but I'll circle back to the poster later. For
there
now,
you are.
Have to get into the slides.
My magic Zoom powers have granted you access.
Great. Let me see if we can get in there. Okay, so as Thomas was saying, this is night 2 of 3. We have a great lineup today, a combination of IHL practitioners and educators, as the last time, going through different parts of the program, and then also our resident educator today, Amy, will also help out with any practical questions about the other parts, even though she's not presenting, any tips and tricks she has. Even if you have questions about the last night's program, I know that she has a lot of tips and tricks for that, if you had any additional questions that you didn't get to answer the last time. And that's all I had to say as an intro, and just let us kick it off. Our program goals are the same as the ones I covered the last time. They are to provide educators with the knowledge necessary to teach students the fundamental principles and applications of IHL, and to provide you with some suggested strategies on how to teach IHL to students, and giving you these examples that we've gone through, these exercises. To Today, we are moving on to the third section. Last night, we covered section 1 and 2, the humanitarian perspective first, with a couple of exercises, and then the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law that myself and Thomas covered. Today, it's the third, the law in action. I'm gonna go over a couple of resources first, and then I'm gonna go over one exercise. Then Amy will cover similarities between IHL and international human rights law and differences between IHL and international human rights law. And then I forgot to update the names of the speakers for this slide, but Thomas will cover the third section, which he talked about the last time, where he's going to go more into how a practitioner of IHL in the military implement IHL, to give you that perspective. First, it is me. Let me see if I can stop sharing this screen, because I want to show you something else before I go into the exercise. Let me see if I can get that. Here. So there's a couple of resources that I wanted to share with you. The first one is a resource portal that's called Forced to Fight. This is something that was developed based on this curricula as well by the Canadian Red Cross. This is an animated decision tree where students are presented with different cases or stories about people that are forced to fight for different reasons. So I'm going to just click a couple into this. So here you have, there's 4 different stories about Anna, Tom, Nora, and Miguel. Just to choose one of them to show you how this looks like. I now have chosen to use the link for the teachers, which means you can see whatever the students are seeing, but then you can also go into the teachers' resources and see what's available there at the same time. So here you're given a background story to begin with about an indigenous village in the Amazon. The situation will develop and you will follow one character through the whole story. This is Miguel, an 18-year-old man in this community that will be infiltrated by a non-state armed group who is increasingly encroaching on the territory and is connected to the local mining company. So here, the mission starts for the students. Their mission is to help him make decisions to ensure he protects himself, his community, and his land from the consequences of armed conflicts. So here you'll have some more information, and let me just show you the part where they start to. So here is the first sort of decision that the students would have to make, and there are multiple decisions throughout the whole scenario, and at the end you'll be able to see sort of the decision tree where you chose to go one way instead of the other, and where you could have sort of made another decision. Sometimes the prompt will sort of bring you back if there's certain things it wants to teach you, and sometimes it'll let you continue in whatever path that you want to go on. But you can also at the end, when you see the whole decision tree, decide if you want to go back and sort of try again and try different ways of doing that. So I wanted to show you that, and then I also quickly just wanted to show you, if you haven't seen it yet, and I know Thomas said he would share a link, this is our YouTube channel where we have all of our different materials, and the thing that we've been working on lately is to create these different playlists. I'm sure you're seeing this in Norwegian, which is my native language. But here are the playlists. We have something for the youth action campaign. We have the pop culture in IHL, which might be also a great resource because it uses different pop culture themes to show how different concepts of IHL might maybe applied, and this is something that's going to be familiar to the students, right? And then we have our 101 series, sort of the basic principles, something that the teachers might want to look into if they want more insight. And then we have our webinars and events, which are more our special series when we have particular topics we want to explore more. That was just a quick plug for that. Let me see if I can go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. So the law in action, here our objectives are to be able to recognize some of the dilemmas that may arise in respecting IHL and combat situations, and to explore similarities and differences between IHL and human rights law. The key concepts are the same as the ones that Ogden repeatedly said we were going to hammer throughout the whole series. The key concepts: human dignity, the bystander, social pressure, dilemma, and humanitarian act. And I don't know if Amy's going to go into this, but if you also have your own take on sort of how you remember these key concepts throughout the program, that would also, I think, be really helpful for our participants. Force to Fight is the portal I just showed you from the Canadian Red Cross. And then I'm going to cover one exercise for today's class.
Taya, before you do, one of our attendees, Jasmine Curry, has a question. I'm going to unmute her and allow her to ask it.
Yeah.
And yeah, so thanks for using the raise hand function, Jasmine. I'm about to unmute you now.
Hey, Tim, I'm sorry I was not here last week. Quick question for all of you. What can we learn from these type of classes and webinars? And what did we learn last week?
Okay, so I think just to recap sort of the beginning of the course, the whole point of exploring humanitarian law is to give teachers or educators of any kind, really, the resources to see how learning about humanitarian law, humanitarian principles, how it can be implemented into the existing curricula. And it's a program that's already developed by the ICRC. So it comes in a pre-packed packet of resources, both for the students and for the educators. And it can be implemented either fully or piecemeal, depending on what you see as valuable. And it really doesn't require much more than this resource packet. And this course is to run you through all of the exercises and to bring you some perspectives from people that have already implemented them and whatever tips and tricks that they might bring. Did you want to add anything to that, Amy?
Yeah, I think too, a lot of us struggle with coming up with new and interesting things that will captivate our students' interest. But, you know, kids also have this interest in what's going on in the world that we don't always fulfill. And so this is a great way, bringing IHL in, especially with events in the world today, it's a really good way to let them know that what they're seeing on the news, there are rules. And then they know when the rules are being violated, and they can speak about this then in an intelligent and informed way. They're capable of, as we all know, a whole lot. And this gives them the language to question what they're seeing.
Thank you. Did that answer your question, or was there anything else that you would like to? I don't know if Thomas has dropped the resource packet in the chat, but if not, he'll drop it again, and so you'll be able to see through that whole thing too, how it all sort of fits together, since you missed the first one.
And Taya, we've got your presenter view right now.
That's okay.
Okay.
That's not what I wanted you to see. But
It's 3/4 of what I always do, so I thought you would want to know.
I have two screens up, so I don't really know what you were seeing or not seeing.
You
Are
got
you
it.
seeing the
You're
right
good
one
now.
You're good now.
Oh, okay,
I do this when I have two screens too.
great. So the first exercise that I'll run you through today under the third section of this course is the exercise called Go It Hurt Under Attack. So this is an exercise where you'll introduce your students to a story about a planned attack by NATO forces against Taliban fighters planting an IED. It's at some point called off because there's a young boy observed in the area of operations herding goats, who, from what they can see, would likely have been injured or killed during the attack. The way that this exercise is done is that the students are first broken up into small groups, showing the article. The article you can see here, it's very, very short. And they go over that, while the facilitators or the teachers, they have the full story of what happened, because this is based on a real story. So you'll have some more details that you can sort of add into the discussion as you would like. But they are given a very short prompt and this photo to discuss first in groups, and then to come together and discuss them with the whole class. And it's important that you also remind them that it's based on a true story. It's a true story of something that happened. Facilitators are also given rules of IHL that could be implicated if people want to talk about rules, but that is not the specific purpose of the story. It's more to talk through the dilemmas that appear and sort of infuse IHL concepts as you see fit. Suggested amount of time for this exercise is 20 minutes. Here you have it in a bigger format, so you can see the text that would be provided to the students. This is the concept that they're seeing. And then you have questions that you can ask both in the groups and then when you're together again in a class. What are the options available to the pilots, the commanders, and the Taliban insurgents? What are the possible consequences of each actions, and which rules apply to the situation? So I thought that we could do one of these questions. I'll go back to the text that you would have been provided as a student. I'll give you a couple minutes to read through it, and then we will tackle the first question in the chat. Okay, let's turn to the first question. If you can put in the chat, what are the options available to the pilots, the commanders, and the Taliban insurgents at this moment in time? Knowing only what you know from that little snippet. Okay, the insurgents could stop what they're doing and flee so that the child isn't in danger. Wait, I guess this applies to all parties involved. The pilots could shoot regardless. They certainly could do that. Someone points out that someone could think more creatively about seeking shelter for safety. The insurgents could continue with their activity in hopes that the pilot doesn't shoot because of the child. This touches on something that's called a human shield too, if they were doing this intentionally. Not likely the Taliban will stop their action. Do not attack if there's a civilian there. Wait for the civilian to be out of danger. Could send in ground troops, an alternative approach. The commander could order the pilots to disengage and keep the drone observing the insurgents until a time they aren't around civilians anymore. So this goes along with the wait. Give it more time. I think we've covered a pretty broad range of potential ways of approaching this. And I would like to ask you, Amy, if you would, when you sort of get all of these different responses from people in an exercise like this, how do you typically sort of facilitate the discussion moving forward? Do people start discussing with each other, or is it typically necessary for you to then infuse other questions or facts or sort of question people's answers? How do you typically approach it?
So I've done it a couple of different ways. One, so sometimes because this subject is so new to them, they are often, my students, even at the college level now, are hesitant to engage. They don't want to be wrong. And so sometimes I do pair and share, which is a very common technique, and assign each of the groups one of the scenarios. Or if I have multiples, then I can give 2 or 3 of them the same scenario and see what they come up with. But I try to link them back to which rules apply in the situation. So for example, if somebody had suggested, well, one of the options is for them to continue, for the fighter pilots to continue with their attack, right? So one of those groups could take that one and say, well, which rules apply? Well, we want to protect civilian life. We don't want to hurt this child, but is he acceptable collateral damage for military necessity? And so you'll get one group that's like, heck no, you can't do it. There's child there. Another one's like, well, if it's strategic and it's an imperative and there's military necessity, then theoretically you could. So trying to tie all of those different scenarios back to the rules. So I'll usually put up a slide that has the main principles of IHL on it. So then that helps them think about how those different scenarios apply.
Yeah. And how good are the students about tying it to rules, as opposed to sort of what the gut feeling, the gut reactions, the ethical, moral ways that they've learned to think up until that point, you think?
They're actually pretty good, because one of the points that we emphasize over and over is that morality and the law are not the same thing. What we feel is right is not necessarily what the law allows. And so we talk a lot about that. But so if I say, okay, I get where you're coming from, I get that this is how we think, but in this scenario, we're bound by these rules. So you got to connect it back to these rules. So sometimes it's just a matter of keeping them on task.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I am just checking the chat to see if we had any questions before we move on to your part of this.
One quick question. This is probably useful for Amy, but Robert asks, what level of student is forced to fight directed towards?
I think when the Canadians made this, my understanding was that it was really kind of targeted at kind of middle school, early high school, because you see from the ages of the young people in the scenarios. But I've done it with multiple. I would not do it obviously younger than 13, because there are some challenging scenarios. But students, it prods students to think even at higher levels.
Thanks, Amy.
So takeaways is that the primary objective of this session is to analyze the dilemma created by the situation, illustrate the challenges, try to tie it back to the rules, but also sort of think about the practical difficulties connected to a dilemma like this. And it's not going to be one of those scenarios where you have a right answer. There's multiple right answers to this, and it's not about figuring out whether it's a lawful attack or not, but how to sort of illustrate the difficulties through the lens, as Amy was saying, of the different rules that you apply to situations.
And they will try to litigate this. Like older students in particular, late high school, early college, will try to litigate this. And so it is a matter of keeping them on task.
Right. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Amy Atchison, which I have not checked whether you're still Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations, but I'm hoping that you still are. Last time Ogden had retired between the last slide and this year's slide.
I actually changed universities and got promoted. So
There you go.
Well, professor,
Even more
yay.
qualified this time around.
So thank you for having me. I love IHL. I've helped a little bit with the curriculum, and I've been adapting it for use at different educational levels for several years now. So you can tweak exercises to make them a little more complex for, say, honor students. You can kind of make them a little less complex for a younger crowd. But students, I really feel like they appreciate being treated as if this is something that's relevant to them, because it is. They are seeing this on the news. They are wondering, well, that doesn't seem right. How can the Russians just shell entire apartment complexes? How can they shell a maternity ward? Well, legally they can't, right? And so I think students don't, at any level, most of the time, have the vocabulary to talk about what they're seeing, and that this helps them to know that their instincts are correct, that what is happening in many cases in the world is not right, and it gives them a way to talk about it. All right, so let's get into the similarities and differences in IHL. Do I have, oh, there we go. All right, so as always, human dignity, bystander, social pressure, dilemma, and humanitarian acts are our key concepts. I'm going to focus a lot on human dignity in particular here, because that's a common thread for IHL and IHRL. So International Humanitarian Law versus International Human Rights Law. And students do get confused about this. I know grown people that get confused about this because the titles are so very similar. And the essence of them is similar. Now, if you are like me, you love a good turnkey product, right? Which is what IHL is. And yes, you certainly can create scenarios through themes and literature that are age appropriate to students. That's a really good way to make it click in their heads. But if you are like me as an educator, the turnkey is nice, but sometimes you feel like you need to know more so that if they ask you off the wall questions, you can answer them. So there is a great resource on the ICRC page, and it's IHL and IHRL, and it gives you a nice synopsis of the differences. It's definitely not aimed at middle schoolers and high schoolers, but more at folks like us. But if you feel like you need to dig in a little bit more, it's a great resource. ICRC is always my go-to for additional resources on anything IHL. As the keepers, they have the best info. All right, so let's get into it. We have two things that we do here. So IHRL and IHL are very distinct but complementary branches of international law. IHL has a lot of ancient roots, right? We have evidence from ancient Africa that it was forbidden to salt wells. Right? So there are different humanitarian rules, although my guess is that some of them didn't always have humanitarian roots, but they had humanitarian outcomes, right? But so we know that in cultures across the world, there have been rules of warfare. Not always followed, but there have been rules. So the rules of war, some of them have ancient roots. International humanitarian rights law is a much more modern body of law. It comes out of a lot of times Enlightenment principles, and it really gets enshrined in the modern era, 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But if you read the whole Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's a lot. So what IHL curriculum designers have done is really shortened that and made it very, very clear how the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights apply to international human rights law. And so they've given you a very, very clear way to show that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So as you can already see just from this short, very brief introduction to the UDHR, you can see that it is very much about all of the things that make that give humans dignity, that help to keep us healthy and alive. And those are things that are common to both, but very much laid out in the UDHR. Now, some of the things that students get confused about is, okay, wait, IHRL, when does it apply? Always. It always applies. Applies to everyone, everywhere, almost all the time. And I had to say almost because governments can, in extreme circumstances, they can sometimes suspend particular rights. That comes in handy in the next lesson. So that's why I'm making sure to point it out. Whereas IHL applies only in times of armed conflict, whether it's international or non-international. Tama, such a good question. So the UDHR in and of itself, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is actually not legally enforceable. Everybody goes, well, but it's true. However, almost every right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been enshrined in a legally binding treaty. There are multiple human rights treaties. So almost every right in the UDHR is theoretically enforceable. International law is sometimes called a rudimentary branch of the law. One of the challenges, who's going to enforce it? Right? We have limited enforcement mechanisms, and it's generally voluntary. You have volunteered to be enforced. So for example, the United States belongs to the International Court of Justice, which is about state issues, but it is not a member of the International Criminal Court. So Americans cannot, are not subject to the treaties that form the ICC. So enforceable is a challenging concept in international law, simply because we don't have a world government that makes those laws and then has the power to enforce them. That's probably not a satisfactory answer, but my students at a general level will just go, gray area. Right? Much of international law is a gray area. So sometimes I view them more as an international hope, and that I hope we will meet, rather than we can force governments to meet. But governments are responsible for IHRL. IHRL is about how governments treat people, right? So this is the code. It's very similar for American educators. It's very similar to the Bill of Rights, which says, here's what we are protected from, right? Our government cannot infringe upon. Which branch of government is responsible for enforcing rights? Well, all of them in theory. But since there's not an international government, it's up to the state how it chooses to interact with international law, if it chooses to interact with international law. If it chooses to see the validity of international courts, or if it chooses not to. That is the unfortunate truth of international law. Although I do see it as a massive step forward that we have created international criminal laws and we hold people accountable for war crimes now. The wheels of justice in that case grind very, very slowly, but we have them now. Whereas until the 2000s, we didn't. So, all right. So, IHRL always applies. The basics of it are laid out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which this is made easy for the students to understand what's in the UDHR. So it always applies, and states can, in limited fashion, in states of emergency, sometimes suspend some of these rights. For example, US suspended habeas corpus in Civil War. All right. Can we flip to the next slide? All right. So why do I tell you this? Well, because this is a great exercise to do with your students. And it helps them to see the differences of when it applies. Well, we know IHRL always applies, and IHL only applies in times of conflict. Can it be limited or suspended? I think I mentioned. Human rights law can be, but I don't think I said it. IHL cannot. You can't just say, we're suspending IHL today so that I can bomb this dam. No, we do not do that. And who is protected? In human, actually, can we look at the bigger one? Sorry, I forgot. Is that on the next page, I think? There we go. All right, so then this way you can see all of them. So if you have, this is one is actually pretty easy to set up if you use a clicker response system. So if you use a clicker response system like Turning Point or Top Hat, you can set this one up and then they can do it electronically. Otherwise, paper and scissors work very nicely. So social customs are often, so IHL applies to all governments, all individuals, everyone involved in this armed conflict, no matter whether they've signed the treaty or not, period. A war crime is a war crime is a war crime. Human rights law, well, we've said as a global society, these are the rights that everyone technically has, but there's no one who can force a government, like say, well, I won't take sides, we're neutral and impartial, but a non-democratic regime cannot be forced to allow their citizens to exercise their human rights. So social and cultural customs often do affect whether or not people are able to exercise their human rights, but the fact that a government prevents them from exercising them doesn't mean they don't have them. It means they live in an oppressive regime that is preventing them from exercising those rights. Okay. I hope that answered the question. Also, I rambled. Sorry about that. Okay. This exercise works really well with your students in little groups, 2 or 3, and then we let them move the parts and pieces around and say what applies where. So when does human rights law apply? Put it in the chat. Which one of these does human rights law apply, do you think? When? I know it is unfortunate that non-democratic states and even democratic states, I mean, we see democratic states abridge people's human rights on the regular. We have more mechanisms for accountability, but not all the governments are not always held accountable for those, for stepping on people's rights. All right, anybody want to put it in the chat? When does human rights law apply? From the choices in the cutout boxes below. At all times. Thank you, Sharon. That is correct. When does IHL apply? Y'all don't free ride on Sharon now. Excellent. Thank you. Is it Ray? Thank you. Armed conflicts. All right. Can human rights law be suspended? Yes. So human rights law, governments can, but only some rights and for a limited time only, suspend human rights law. On the other hand, can IHL be suspended or limited? Correct. Is it Anajna? Oh no, I've pronounced that wrong. I'm very sorry. Anjana. Okay. Oops. Sorry, we just had a new message come in. Thank you, Angela. All right. How about who is protected by human rights law? Now, so, oops, two new messages. Individuals from government, correct. All right, so human rights law protects individuals from government, and then who does IHL protect? And now if you were not here last week and hadn't had a chance to look at that yet, this one is more of a challenge. It does, it protects civilians, and it also though protects soldiers who are no longer in combat. So it's going to protect individuals who do not or who no longer take part in fighting. So if I'm injured and I am in a military hospital, I may be a soldier, but I am out of combat. So it protects me and everyone in the hospital. All right, and then, yes, exactly. Thank you, Polly. Thank you, Elizabeth. All right, and then our last one, who is bound by human rights law? Who is responsible for ensuring that rights are protected? That you are protected from them. Governments, thank you, Margot. Thank you, Anjana. And then finally, we have one left. Who is bound by IHL? Excellent, Robert. Governments, armed groups, and individuals. That one sometimes really throws my students. They're like, well, how can individuals be bound by this? Well, let's say I live in a combat zone and a wounded enemy fighter comes to my door for help. I can't just summarily execute the man because that would be a war crime. It might not be a gross violation, but it would be wrong and illegal, right? So that's how individuals, not just governments, armed groups, but all of us are bound by IHL. But that one really throws them for some reason, and I haven't quite processed why. But this is true. There are non-military activists too. So, but that one gets them. So this one, you can also get some discussion within the small groups about this, and you can hear whether or not it's clicking. But these are some of the main differences that they generally, that we really want them to get from this. And the big one for me is for them to say, okay, I get it. IHL only applies when there is an armed conflict, but human rights law is always. There are tensions between the two. They're complementary bodies of law, but there are some tensions. Like the classic example is you have a right to not be arbitrarily killed. That's human rights law, but death happens in IHL. And so when we say there are contradictions, there are. But generally, we would say that the law that applies all the time is human rights law. But in this specific circumstance, in a time of armed conflict, IHL is what governs the immediate action. In theory, Robert, human rights law is universal. I only say in theory because we have so many governments that oppress people and do not allow them to exercise those rights. Exactly. Reality bites. All right. Oh, yep. All right. So They don't engage a huge amount in the complexities at the middle school age. Sometimes juniors and seniors have had a little bit more, maybe in Western Civ, where they engage a little bit more in the IHL and IHRL kind of dilemmas, right? Because the law is complicated. Sometimes it seems contradictory. And so you'll get a little bit more interaction with older students on this, but with younger students, they're like, okay, I get it. Stop beating my dead horse, Ms. Atchison, right? But I think the main reason that they get confused is that the laws really do share the same basic interest, which is to protect human life and human dignity. And so it seems the same to them. Many of the same elements apply in both branches of the law, right? You can't torture people, whether it's in war or not in war. That's kind of a big one for me. So that's, I think, though, where they get confused is there's overlap, but they're distinct and they happen in different times. So one doesn't replace the other, because human rights law always applies, and humanitarian law only applies during times of war, which I think is that we have discussion questions too, right, Taya? So they usually, they do better sometimes, I think, with the differences. The similarities are a challenge, because they're like, okay, you got to treat people right. That's the basic similarity. I mean, if you're going to get cut to the chase, that really is the basic similarity, is you have to treat people appropriately. But the differences seem to stand out to them more. So I usually get more, discussion on the differences than I do on the similarities. What do you guys have as questions? We've been trying to answer them as we go.
Let's see if there are any afterburners, as we call them.
Oh, I like that. I'm going to steal that.
If not, feel free to put them in the chat as we move forward. We'll circle back to Amy before we break it off for tonight. I will shift it over to Thomas for his presentation. I'll stop sharing mine. He has his own new slide deck that he wanted to share with you. And I will let you take it away, Thomas.
Hey, thanks. You get this into presentation mode. Thanks, Amy. That was really fantastic. And Taya as well. I think it's important to see how these materials look, and you'll find them in the links that are in the chat. You can go up and find both the links to the mini EHL program, which is free to download, and also the full suite of EHL modules, which is in the earlier link, and we'll repost those as well. This 3-night program is built around the EHL module, but it's all sort of ready baked, and the sort of text and whatnot that you've seen on the slides so far, including last week, those are pulled right from the material. So you're seeing what this looks like. It's a real turnkey approach. So without further ado, I'm going to branch off just a little bit, because we like to be really practical with EHL, and understanding that it's important to recognize that IHL is a body of law, International Humanitarian Law, or the law of armed conflict. It's in place on the battlefield. Now we'll get into how this law operates and sort of the differing ways that that this law is sort of put into action and viewed by different entities. But at the end of the day, it's militaries, it's non-state armed groups like the Taliban or ISIS or others who are doing the fighting on the ground, and by extension, needing to adhere to these principles, these laws. And certainly you have civilians that are almost at all times caught in the crosshairs and endangered by armed conflict. And that's really the critical intersection point where IHL really matters. But my background outside of the Red Cross and my position here as senior counsel in international humanitarian law is as an Army officer, an Army judge advocate, in other words, an Army lawyer, as others might know it. So the JAG Corps within any branch of the military is, of the US military, I should say, is the group of attorneys, the group of legal advisors, as some refer to us, who operate in a variety of capacities in uniform. Every branch of the US military and the Coast Guard, even though it's within Homeland Security now, has its own JAG Corps. We're independent from one another. We don't all fall under one umbrella. Oftentimes you'll have JAG Corps that work together. So a JAG officer from the Army might work with a JAG officer from the Navy. That's not uncommon. We operate jointly, but we have our own stovepipe commands. JAGs do a whole lot of stuff, everything from criminal law to administrative law, assisting soldiers with basic problems that they have, legal problems like wills and immigration issues. But critically, judge advocates out in combat environments provide legal advice and advise on IHL in action. And we provide a critical training component that I'll explain a little bit more about as we get into the presentation. Now, I'm still in the JAG Corps. I'm an Army Reserve officer, a major, and in my current role, I do criminal defense work, but I spent a little more than 7 years on active duty. I've been a JAG officer for about 12 years or so now. It was my first job out of law school, and it's been a good one for myself and my family. But in any event, within my various jobs in the JAG Corps, one of the most sort of impactful on me was advising on IHL. Now, I started my IHL sort of career in garrison, as we say, which means here stateside. I was learning that body of law. They don't really teach this. They didn't teach it at my law school in North Carolina. And certainly you get a limited bit of education about IHL in your JAG training. So I was learning on the job. And then I deployed to Afghanistan. And for a year during Operation Enduring Freedom, I advised on these rules as a young captain in combat conditions down in Kandahar province, where this photo is taken from. And this is the period of time, 2012 to 2013, before we handed off full control to what was then the Afghan National Forces. Obviously, they have disbanded now. But the US and our NATO allies were in the lead in all combat missions. And so every day for about 365 days, give or take, my job was to sort of observe what was going on the battlefield, provide advice, oftentimes in real time, and help commanders make the right decision, help commanders make, as we say, the ethically, legally, and morally correct decision. So we'll talk about IHL from that perspective, from the military's perspective. And just understand it's not a different set of rules. The military doesn't operate by a different body of law. There's a little bit of confusion about that, I've run into soldiers that think that sort of what's known as rules of engagement are really the limit of what they're bound to. And in reality, it's all of IHL. All of IHL applies to a military force that's in an armed conflict. Certainly in the context of Afghanistan, the conflict that I was there in, or Ukraine, those armed forces are bound by the body of those rules. And while the military will look at it through one end of the prism in terms of how can we operate and achieve our military objectives, defeat the enemy, do the things that we need to do to get to that end state. How can we do those things legally and within the bounds of the law? The humanitarian perspective, and the reason humanitarian is in right in the heart of the IHL name, is that the perspective there is the balancing, the injection of humanity in just an innately inhumane practice which is warfare. So when we talk about the humanitarian perspective or the Red Cross, Red Crescent perspective, we don't have a different set of rules that we're playing by, but we look at this, we don't have a military objective to achieve on any battlefield. We're not doing the fighting, but what we are doing, and certainly the ICRC plays a frontline role in their role as sort of the guardians of IHL and the keepers of IHL, as Tay and Amy mentioned, is ensuring that that military necessity, so the reason that military force is being used in a given scenario, we've got to attack those two insurgents who are bearing the improvised explosive device in that exercise we did earlier, that necessity is balanced on the scales with that of humanity, with the need to preserve and protect the innocent on the battlefield. That's what makes IHL so critical. And so for the military, and certainly I'll speak only to the US military and the limited NATO partners, countries like the UK, Australia, that I served alongside in my capacity. But the overriding feeling amongst our troops and the commanders that I advised was, we had a mission to do, but we're a professional fighting force. We're there to ostensibly protect the Afghan people in that mission and provide them a measure of security while trying to root out the Taliban. And so there was a real push and an insistency on following the law to a T. There were no corners that were shortcut, even in really dynamic situations where it's a really exigent set of circumstances. There's not a lot of time. That didn't operate as an excuse to forget the law. And so what I saw was, first and foremost, even though the military is looking at this body of law through a different prism, they have a different set of objectives, obviously. The end desire was the same. We wanted to preserve humanity for a variety of reasons, because it was the right thing to do, because not abiding by these rules and flouting them would really degrade and make it more difficult for us to accomplish our mission. Certainly we were there at the invitation of the Afghan government, and violating IHL repeatedly is a quick way to get yourself kicked out of a country and have your mission end. So I use that as just an illustrator, because there's sometimes this idea that the military plays by different rules when it's warfare, that there shouldn't be rules when there's warfare going on. That's just not the case. Here in the United States, the military, and I speak with regard to all branches of the military, they handle their own IHL training. In other countries, you'll see that their National Society of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Society, something like the Canadian Red Cross, they might have a more advanced or integrated role in helping train soldiers there about these rules, these laws. That's not necessarily the case. The Red Cross, the American Red Cross, is present on every US military base here in the continental United States, and then a number of them overseas, including in places like Kuwait. But we're fulfilling a very different role. We're not there to teach or train soldiers. We're not there to have a serious role, a formal role with regard to IHL. We do occasionally do sort of voluntary-based training. Certainly we have here in the American Red Cross dozens and dozens of IHL volunteers who are uniformed service members that bring that experience and that background to their volunteer work. But the military handles its own training, and that can look a variety of different ways. So you have the business of actually training soldiers. So whether it's a basic trainee, so young 18-year-old soldier right out of high school. I remember I enlisted right out of high school as a private in the Army and shipped right off to basic training a couple months after I graduated. My training as a young soldier there in the Army was handled by that center symbol, the Army's Training and Doctrine Command. Later, when I would become an officer, I went through what's called the ROTC program, the Reserve Officer Training Corps. That's the logo you see on the left there. And we fell under a different arm a subset of TRADOC, as they call it, Training and Doctrine Command. But Cadet Command oversees the body of cadets who are actively training and may one day become commissioned officers, so higher ranking individuals within the military structure, those that will fill command roles, for instance, at some point in time. So within those training commands, there is doctrinal material, everything from how the Army teaches something simple like basic rifle marksmanship or land navigation, but also baked within there is some basic foundational level training on international humanitarian law. You're not going to see a class like this, but what you do see is it get put into place in action out in the field. So you'll get a little bit of instruction, verbal instruction on these rules, but really you get your feet wet in training on these scenarios in exercises. So you go out and you might be using say weapons with blank rounds or paintball guns or something like that in your training, but the military will actually design exercises with fake civilians involved. So other soldiers who are playing the role of civilians or maybe news media. And the point there is to get you conditioned and train you on how to interact. And it's an environment where mistakes can be made, but they can be corrected without significant consequences. And so I can recount to you tons of times within both my early days as a young enlisted soldier and my training as an officer, where we would have exercises with exactly this sort of thing involved. In fact, and my last point on this is ROTC cadets, so those that are students that are becoming officers, so these are usually college students, they have a required block of IHL training. The military calls IHL the law of armed conflict, but those are synonyms. But they have an hour block on the law of armed conflict training that's classroom based. Lots of times Red Cross volunteers will help out with those classes, those that have military experience. And so they get that classroom balance with the field work as well. Now, the business of training on IHL doesn't end there. It's sort of a career-long endeavor that is baked in at all echelons when you train. So here on the right side, this is a scene from almost any military training exercise out in the field. So if you know anything about the military, you know, at least in the Army, we love our field time. So go out in the woods, camp a little bit, simulate combat conditions, and really train on different mission sets. In the 9-month or so run up in my training to the deployed to Afghanistan, we had about 4 of these. It spent about 60 or so days out in the field if you combined it all. And baked within there are tons of scenarios where we're having to grapple with the decision making, grapple with factors that implicate IHL, that require commanders, that require soldiers in these exercises to go through the thought process and not just pull a trigger, but do so, as I mentioned, ethically, morally, and legally in a sound fashion. So the military really puts an emphasis on this, and at the core of all of that is this this sort of pride stamp that we are a professional fighting force. We're upheld, or we hold ourselves, and the American people hold our military to a certain set of high standards, and incumbent within that is to abide by the rule of law, and that's really critical. And so the military goes to great lengths to train on this. This is a great I don't expect you to like understand this slide, but this is like classic military PowerPoint style. I put this up here because the business of implementing IHL on the battlefield can be a complex one. When you're in combat conditions, there is a 24/7 cycle of planning that is taking place, both near term and long range. And that's layered on top of what I would call dynamic missions. So a unit comes under fire and they have to react quickly, or they come upon the enemy on a patrol or something like that, and they have to dynamically react to that. The deliberate planning cycle, the targeting cycle that's sort of illustrated here, this isn't comprehensive by any means, but it is a multi-step process. And legal advisors are involved throughout this process. The whole goal here, and really the goal of the military with regard to IHL, is to best inform the commander. Before a commander makes a decision to use military force, they want to have the best information, the most information available in a time-sensitive manner. And so depending on your mission, depending on your planning, you're going to have different amounts of time to be able to do that. But the idea here is that a legal advisor is involved during this process. And so during my time in Afghanistan, we had a series of meetings. I was on a targeting working group, which was comprised of folks with artillery background, infantry background, so war fighters, as we call them, combat troops. These are sort of senior ranking officers with lots of training and folks that we had worked and trained together for months and months on end. But we would get together, we would work on whatever the current set of plans were, and then those would make their way up. And every day we would have an operation sync meeting, an op sync meeting for short. And we would synchronize our missions. So these missions would get briefed out on a regular basis, these offensive missions that were in various planning stages. And at a certain stage, the commander that has the decision-making authority is in the room. And so you've gone from planning to presenting a set of recommendations, presenting a plan, and it's the commander's duty, the commander's legal obligation to exercise his or her authority and make a decision on whether that mission moves forward. But baked within that entire process is that advice on IHL. And so we did this in every facet, from actual combat operations, so going out, planning patrols and counterinsurgency operations like that, to what they call psychological operations, so using things like leaflets and radio broadcasts and whatnot to try to shape locals' opinions about insurgent efforts or our efforts, that sort of thing. All of those things had legal advice baked in on it, and all of those things required me and our other team of legal advisors to really marshal IHL on a daily basis, if not hourly basis. Now, when it comes to implementing a military operation, really the onus rests with that military commander. The military is built on this hierarchical structure. I'm like muddling my words here. It's like I've got cotton in my mouth. This structure that's top down. So you have sort of frontline soldiers, young soldiers, privates, and whatnot, and they're sort of localized lower level leadership that are out on the battlefield. But you have commanders, so officers at different echelons that are vested with a varying degree of decision-making authority. Now, somebody like a company commander, so a young captain, probably 28 to 30 years old, somewhere in that range, with a few years of experience under their belt, they'll have a certain set of tools, a certain level of decision-making authority at their relatively low level. You march all the way up to say a 3 or a 4-star general. They're going to have authority with regard to a much larger area, a much broader set of tools that they're able to marshal and give orders to the vast number of subordinate units and troops that they fall under. But what you see here is a scale. So it's sort of an inverse pyramid in terms of responsibility, where at the top of the pyramid, that highest ranking officer, that highest ranking commander is going to have the broadest level of authority. And then you get all the way down to the soldier on the ground, the young private who might have no authority. Maybe one of their low-level leaders has a very limited amount as well. But as I mentioned in the chart before, there's a persistent planning and advising process all along there. What's interesting right now, and what we're seeing the military pivot to, is a different way of approaching warfighting. For the last 20 to 25 plus years, we've been in what we call a counterinsurgency environment. So in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, we've really been focused on fighting non-state armed groups that are decentralized. They don't have the resources of a country. They're blending in and out of the civilian population, a very, very different fight. The military is now pivoting to what we call large-scale combat operations, or LSCO. And so interestingly, the respective JAG corps for the different branches are approaching that pivot, with a sort of a renewed focus on IHL. What we're seeing play out in a combat environment like Ukraine is in a situation of a country versus a country fighting each other, which is thankfully unusual in this day and age. But at the scale of a conflict like Ukraine, which is the biggest international armed conflict we've seen, certainly since the Gulf War, probably since World War II, you're seeing a really fast pace of combat action on a scale that is just very, very different than a counterinsurgency operation. And there isn't always the time to have the physical presence of a JAG officer, a military legal advisor, like you can in counterinsurgency operations. During my time in Afghanistan, I sat in a command center surrounded by stakeholders with expertise in areas like aviation or field artillery. We had a commander on the floor. We had almost immediate access to the overall commander for our region that had decision-making authority. That won't necessarily be the case in a large-scale combat operation. Those commanders operating far up on the front aren't going to have time to sit there and call back and go through the process of getting connected with a legal advisor. They need to be able to stand on their own. So the JAG Corps, certainly the Army JAG Corps, is really putting a focus in training to get those commanders really proficient on IHL and really able to stand on their 2 feet and to be able to operate independently. So not completely detached from the help of a JAG officer, but certainly enough to know the rules, to know what they have to weigh in their decision making, to know the information that they need to bring to bear to make those ethically, morally, and legally sound decisions, oftentimes in a rapid-paced environment. So after that, after the commander makes that decision based on that sort of extensive planning phase, you have mission execution, and there's a constant sort of feed of information, at least on the NATO or the U.S. military side. We're getting just an inordinate stream of data in from the battlefield. In the command center that I worked in, if you can picture a NASA mission control center with like the tier desks and the big screens up front showing all sorts of imagery, that's what we operated in there in Kandahar province. The difference was, instead of rockets and planets and whatnot, we had battlefield imagery. We had large-scale live updating maps. We had persistent feeds from different drones that were available to us. And we'd monitor at our sort of higher echelon the execution of various missions. If there was a dynamic engagement, so soldiers that came into contact with the enemy and were needing to make decisions rapidly, we had the ability to pull that up to sort of real time, provide advice on those things. And as you see on the right side there, that's where you have a constant assessment of the situation going on. I was fortunate enough to be in the hip pocket of our commanders and be able to provide that advice on an ongoing basis. But after every mission like that, the military is coming back and looking at lessons learned. Even in sort of small scale missions, the military is constantly in this assessment phase where we're looking to shape what we do in an effort to achieve the mission, shape our efforts, etc. And within that is an assessment of our legal compliance as well. Multinational forces are just a product of the post-World War II environment that we live in. Entities like NATO are very prevalent, and I would submit to you that multinational encounters or environments like we saw in Afghanistan or Iraq are going to be much more common in the future than something like Ukraine, where it's just a singular force fighting each other. I was on a NATO mission to Afghanistan. That's what ISAF is. It's the International Security Force For Afghanistan, that's just what we were called. But there comes this intersection in how or interpretations of IHL. As you've seen here today, even those of us on this call analyzing that scenario earlier with the insurgents, we all had different interpretations. The question was, what can be done here? And all of us had great ideas, but they weren't all the same. And that gets down to the sort of general ballpark idea that not all of IHL is rooted in a common analysis or a common assessment. So different countries may have different interpretations of rules. So something like the ability to use force in self-defense. So when soldiers come into contact with the enemy, at what point can they use force to defend themselves? How imminent does the danger have to be? Countries view that differently. A country like the United States may have a really expansive view of self-defense. So, hey, we don't have to wait until we're being fired upon to use force. Another country within a multinational force may have a different interpretation. They may say, hey, we need to get a little bit closer in terms of the danger threshold before we're comfortable with using force. And that's not to say that any individual nation or military is wrong, but there are aspects of IHL that are going to vary. How the US military does a proportionality analysis, so that's one of our 4 core principles that we talked about during night 1. So how we weigh that military advantage versus the expected civilian loss of life, that may look different between different militaries and how they operate, what their objectives are. Certainly in Afghanistan, we ran into this repeatedly, and it never was a roadblock or a speed bump for us, but it was something that as legal advisors, it was incumbent on us to know these differences. And so I had quite literally a chart, a classified chart with different interpretations, core rules where I had to know the differences in stances or differences in rules between countries. And so in a scenario where, say, US troops were in contact on the ground and you had a British fighter plane that was the only available close air support on station, you needed to know whether that British airplane, based on British interpretation of pertinent IHL rules, could engage. And you needed to be able to relay that advice to commanders. The British pilot or the US troops needed to understand those things as they operated. And so it was an interlocking web, but really one where everyone is rowing in the same direction. We all sort of uniformly had the same desire to abide by the law and really conduct our military operations, even in that environment, with those differences in that ethically, morally, and legally sound manner. So I want to end with a case study here, because you may not know this photo here. I'll get to explain it here in a second. But I want to dispel the notion, or maybe add on to what Taya and Amy have more eloquently described earlier, which is that IHL as a body of law doesn't operate to totally prevent civilian casualties. Amy mentioned that cross-section with morality and legality. And that's a really important concept that I think is really valuable for young students to learn, that is reflected in other bodies of the law. Even something like criminal law. Criminal law doesn't prevent people from getting killed. In fact, people can get killed by other people, and it could be legally justified. You could use self-defense and kill a home invader. And the morality of that may lead you to one conclusion. The legality of that may lead you to another. It's the same with IHL. It doesn't follow that if a civilian is killed during armed conflict by a military, then there is criminal liability, or then there is a violation of IHL. There are gradients to it. And it's important to realize that when we look back, especially with hindsight on military operations, we often have facts that aren't available at the time. And that's not the standard that these situations are judged by, even in something like the Nuremberg trial. So post-World War II, former Nazis are being put on trial for their alleged war crimes in World War II. And in many scenarios, this came up where the court and the prosecutors and everyone sort of sitting in judgment had the benefit of hindsight and facts that weren't necessarily available at the time. And that impacted certain proceedings, even in that conflict where you had sort of a clear, bright line between the good guys and the bad guys. So what IHL does is it looks to it, or it expects, it demands that those making decisions to use force have to operate reasonably, so like a reasonable person, but they have to operate with the information that's known to them at the time. We don't expect military commanders or soldiers to be omniscient. We don't expect them to be all-knowing and all-seeing. They're naturally limited by things like stress, time constraints, intelligence on the battlefield. Those can really be a potent mix, and they can lead to mistakes being made. But a mistake isn't always a criminal one, even in scenarios where the humanity, the morality of the situation may be truly appalling and reasonably appalling in that. So this situation here, and I apologize, normally I have some slide builds. So this incident happened in 2015. In the above photo, this is in Kunduz province, Afghanistan. So this is northern Afghanistan. The situation is that the black outline, the compound in there, is a Doctors Without Borders facility, a field hospital. So MSF is the French name for Doctors Without Borders. There was a U.S. Special Forces team that was operating in vicinity of this complex. They radioed in that they were taking fire from insurgents who were firing from a building. Their radio call went out to a young airman, a member of the Air Force, a JTAC. So those are members of the Air Force. They're considered special forces, but it's their job to coordinate air support to help support other troops that are on the ground. So the Joint Tactical Air Controller. So the JTAC on the ground took his laser sort of designators, this complex device that paints a laser onto a target and helps the aircraft know where to shoot. So he puts the laser on what he believes to be the target that the building that the special forces are taking fire from. And in comes an AC-130H Spectre gunship, which you see on the left side there. Those are heavily modified cargo planes that on one side are outfitted with a tremendous amount of firepower, quite literally artillery on the side. They can really decimate an area, and they're used frequently for close air support for troops on the ground. They get into a circling pattern. As you see there, they tilt up on their side and they just open fire from one side until the mission is complete. And so an AC-130H Spectre comes on station and it opens fire, and you see the after effects there. It hit the target. It quite literally obliterated the center building there. What was not known to the Spectre crew, to the JTAC on the ground, was that this in fact was a Doctors Without Borders hospital, and it was not the building from which the Special Forces team was receiving fire. So the gunship hit the right target, but it was the wrong building. The laser had been placed on the wrong building. So here's some after effects. So this is a truly devastating weapon. Dozens of individuals were killed, doctors, medical personnel, civilians that were being treated in the hospital. To this day, it remains a very, very controversial incident in Afghanistan, and a real flashpoint between the U.S. military and Doctors Without Borders. An investigation ensued, and it found that so that bottom circle there in yellow, you see the hospital facility that was attacked. That was that compound that you saw in the previous slide. Actually, the intended target was quite a ways off, northeast of that complex. So you see it in that other yellow circle there on the right side. And so you have a cascading set of errors that result in a really tragic loss of life and an abhorrent moral situation, right? This is a real life tragic example of that intersection between morality and legality. There's no defending that loss of life. This was just absolutely terrible. However, the investigation revealed that this was a set of human errors, that there was no intent to destroy that hospital facility. There was no intent to unlawfully target or otherwise kill those hospital workers and the patients in an effort to kill a few insurgents. This was just a set of human errors that when added together really added up to an awful tragedy. And so there were no courts martial done. So by that I mean there were no criminal trials, there were no criminal charges that came out of this investigation. That's at least a part of the ongoing controversy with regard to the Doctors Without Borders view of this situation. But the military determined that there was no criminal liability here. Now, there may have been some other actions that were taken administratively, not criminally, against some of the folks involved. So, for doing your duty in a poor fashion, there are all sorts of things that can happen to hamper your career, potentially get you kicked out. But it's not the same as a criminal trial, a finding of guilty, jail time, etc. This is just a really tragic example, but a really apt one of how IHL operates in the real world. IHL didn't prevent these individuals from being killed. IHL didn't prevent or didn't require that a criminal trial come from this sort of incident, because it goes back to that gradient that I mentioned. And certainly from my perspective as a U.S. Army prosecutor and defense attorney, I can tell you that we take these cases really seriously. These investigations are taken very seriously. A lot of effort is expended, rightfully so, into getting to the right answer, to collecting those facts and getting to the truth. And when there are violations, repeatedly the U.S. military has shown that it holds its own to account for those violations. So there were a number of high-profile cases within the last 10 to 12 years, ranging from, if you heard the trial of former Navy SEAL Eddie Gallagher. He was put on trial for killing a ISIS fighter, a teenager who was injured and out of the fight, waiting medical treatment. There are a number of examples of that where the military has not hesitated to bring criminal charges and go after with full force members of its own ranks who have violated IHL. But that's balanced against the reality that not every situation is cut and dry. Not every situation operates in a black and white fashion. There's just a tremendous amount of gray area that is fueled by that sort of human element that's baked into all of this. And I would posit to you that in normal criminal law, it's no different. We'd like to think that criminal trials are all really cut and dry, and if they did it, they're guilty. If they didn't do it, then they're not guilty, or they'll never go to trial. History has shown us time and time again that that's not the case. So I appreciate you bearing with me through all of this. And I hope that it's a lesson that, while you may not bring into the classroom, it may be something that you're able to add some perspective onto your education. So Taya, with that, I'll hand it back over to you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And I also want to send a huge thank you to Amy for coming in and providing all of your tips and tricks and perspectives on all these different topics, and also to all of our participants for engaging in the chat with each other, with us. We are busy, all of us in the IHL team, responding to very detailed questions about IHL in the chat, some of which you can see, some of which you can't see. And it's just such a joy to see people be this engaged in the curriculum. Is there any final words that you want to share, Amy, before we?
I did see a question about who to approach and how. And I know that a lot of chapters do this through JROTC at high schools. That's a good way to get your foot in the door. But also social studies teachers are always looking for ways to engage kids in social studies. So those are two ways, but I know a lot of chapters have had success. I also work with the Youth Action Campaign. And so they've had success with JROTC there. So that's another way that you can maybe get your foot in the door. But for middle school, social studies teachers are the way to go.
Right. That was for Candace's questions about how to approach different school districts with this material, right? Correct. Okay. Any other final questions or thoughts from anyone? If not, I will let everyone sign off. I was, again, not able to put this thing I desperately want to put in the chat, but I'll somehow get it to you. This chart of how to implement IHL in different types of classes. I am seeing nothing. I'm seeing happy things, links, thanks. Okay, thank you everyone for joining in, and we will see each other next week for violations and accountability for IHL violations.